I will announce some entertainment now by probably one of the best swimmers that ever hit this part of the country. She could have went on probably to been an Olympic star. Miss Margaret Brinkley Johnson.
If you believe that, just stand on your head. He pushed me in the mill pond one time, and I almost drowned. So if I'd have been an Olympic swimmer, I know I would have gotten out of that. Clarence Willis, I know how you felt about thinking of names. I've gotten to the point when I meet a bunch of friends that I've known for always, I'll say, well, this is Margaret. I don't want to embarrass them when they can't think of my name, so you might have to announce yourself and see where you're going. I was making a speech one time. This woman, can you hear in the back? And I'll talk about it. This woman on the back row was just raising her hand saying, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. And a woman right down in front of me stood up and turned to her and says, well, I can, and I'll swap places with you. I promised Maudine that I wouldn't go over 10 minutes today, and I love stories, and I collect them. But I'm just going to share one with you today. It's baseball season. How many of you like baseball? Oh, I love it, especially when the Braves play. Well, these two guys, they love baseball like I do. And they said they wanted to go to heaven when they died, but it just wouldn't be heavenly if they didn't play baseball. So they made a pact with each other that the first one that died would some way get message down here whether they played baseball in heaven or not. So one of them died, and it had been about 8 months, and his friend had not heard from him. But one night, he was awakened by somebody saying, George, George, George. He looked up, and his friend was at the end of the bed, and he said, is that you? I said, yeah, it's me. He said, you got me any news? I said, yeah, I got you. Good news and bad news. I said, well, what's the good news? He said, they played baseball in heaven. He said, that's great. What's the bad news? Says you're scheduled to pitch tomorrow. After teaching 35 years, if I had kept a journal of all those years, I could have written a book that would have put Art Linkletter's to shame. Speaking of Art Linkletter, you know, he went into nursing homes, he went places and made himself, you know, known and talked to people. And one day that he was in this nursing home, and he saw this little lady down at the end of the hall, and he went up to her and shook hands with her and says, do you know who I am? She said, no, but if you'll ask that lady down the hall, she'll tell you. There are a few things that come to mind while I was teaching. About half the children would say to the Republicans for which it stands when they salute the flag. I had to explain to them that it was for the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So I had to get that straightened up. And I always had some child or some children that would take God's name in vain. And I would talk about not taking God's name in vain, and that didn't seem to work too much. So I thought I would say, take God's holy name in vain. I would say God's holy name. So one day Eddie came running up to me and he says, Ms. Johnson, Tommy's around there in the scrubbery taking God's name in holy vain. And I said, well, tell him not to take God's name in holy vain. And, you know, we used to have devotional. One of the teachers passed my room one day and the door was open. She said, Margaret, you were preaching instead of teaching. I said, well, they needed some of that too. But I had to talk to the children. We talked about pray. You know, they got where they would just say the Lord's Prayer by rote and didn't pay half attention to what they were saying. So some of them I would say the prayer a lot of times, and then some of them would ask if they could say it. So I was telling them about prayer, that sometimes we prayed for things that it was best that God didn't answer the prayer because it was not good for us. And when we prayed, we need to say, if it's your will. Well, Daddy was sick one time, and I came down and had missed school a day, and a little boy in my room named Victor, the next day, raised his hand and said, could he have the prayer? And I said, yes, and they bowed their heads, and he said, dear God, make Ms. Johnson's daddy well. And then he happened to think, he said, if it's your will, and if it's not, take him straight on to heaven. I said, no, Victor, not now. But then, that I had a little boy named Carl. He came up to me one day and he said, Ms. Johnson, he took his hands out. If you do just as many good things as you do bad things, if they're even, where do you go? He was trying to do one more good thing than he did bad so he could balance the scale a little bit. So I had to let him know that that's not the way you got to heaven. And then, I'll tell you one thing. Your children are gone, but your grandchildren and all, they tell everything when they come to school. If I would have called somebody's named at Mount Pleasant, Florida, I taught at Mount Pleasant, Georgia, then went to Mount Pleasant, Florida, before I went to Thomaston. If I would have called a name, some of these people that went to school then they would know. But it was during the war that I was teaching, and I had one little girl that, boy, she told everything. She told how her daddy kept from going to the army, having to go to serve. I didn't tell them so. I kept all the secrets. But I could have written a book about families in turmoil at that time, too. I had my share of excuses when children were absent. However, I don't believe they were quite the caliber of the ones that came from West Virginia school superintendent I read, untouched spelling and all. Said, dear school, please excuse John for being absent on January the 28th, the 29th, the 30th, the 31st, the 32nd, and the 33rd. Another one. Please excuse Gloria. She's been sick and under the doctor. My son is under the doctor's care and should not take Jim. Please execute him. Please excuse Joyce from Jim for a few days. Yesterday she fell out of a tree and misplaced her hip. Carlos was absent yesterday because he was playing football. He was hurt in the growing part. My daughter was absent yesterday because she was tired. She was in, she spent the weekend with the Marines. Please excuse David from being. It was his father's fault. And then the coach received this from the mother of a girl who declined to dress for physical ed. And she wrote back to the coach. She said, Wanda said you said she had to take Jim. Take him where? I talked with a Mrs. Shepherd, that you might remember. She was not there the 3 years that I was at Mount Pleasant, Florida. But she told me about the experience that her niece had her first day of teaching. She lived at Stark, Florida, and that's where her teaching experience began. It happened at Sparks, at Stark. I think she was from somewhere else, but it took place at Stark. And she was getting the children's names, and I imagine it must be about the 4th grade, it sounded that way. When she was getting the children's names, this little boy, the first one, said his name was Dammit Jones. And she said, now I know that could not be your name. He said, yes it is. She said, your mother wouldn't have named you, damn it. And he said, well, she did. She walked up to the principal's office and she said, I'll tell you the very first day of my teaching, I don't know whether I want to ever come back or not. I've got a little boy in my room that insists that his name is Dammit Jones. He said, well, there have been 5 generations of Dammits in this community. He said, nobody thinks anything in the world about it. So during the year, she became just accustomed to calling on Dammit, and she did Tom, Bill, John, and whomever. And this, was perfectly fine. One day they had a new school superintendent that came in, and I can assure you that when you have a visitor come in, somebody in the room is going to want to show off. So Dammit was in the back of the room just raising his hand and trying to get her attention. She wouldn't even look in his direction. But after a while, he just blurted out. He didn't care whether she was looking or not. And he says, teacher, may I spell, can I spell Constantinople? She says, now, damn it, you know you can. Constantinople. The superintendent put his hands on his hip and says, well, hell, let him try. The story is told of 2 men who went squirrel hunting one afternoon. One was slightly tongue-tied, which made him stubborn, and the other one had St. Vitus dance. And after walking through the woods for a way, the tongue-tied man said, give me a shell. He took careful aim and fired and missed. And the man with the St. Vitus dance said, let me try it. He aimed and he danced all around and he fired, and the squirrel fell out of the tree. And the other man said, well, no, that dang wonder you hit it. You aimed all over the place. I may have aimed all over the place these last few minutes, but I hope I was able to give you something to laugh about. Until next time, thank you.
Other memories around Faceville, and that's a hard act to follow.
Oh, shoot. I tell you, I'm glad I wasn't following you. Jack and I backed on the Wingate's left, and he bothers me. We
bother each other.
Yeah.
Her mother was my great aunt, right?
Right.
And Devon and Margaret's mother, my great aunt. And we lived together, eat together. Used to
But
go
never
up.
slept together.
Never did. Where we swam, where she had her accident,
Yeah.
was in Alfred's Mill Pond, and I want to tell you, they couldn't grind meal there for 3 or 4 days after she fell in. Now the same thing went for Betsy's Mill Pond. That's where WB used to get up on top of the shed and go do a cannonball off in there, and Mr. Betts couldn't grind down there for 2 or 3 days. Well, he wasn't as big then as he is now. And Ellis's Mill Pond, and ain't never been no colder place in the world than that creek is down there, because the sun didn't hit it nowhere. It would chill you to death in July. And Howell's Mill, or McDaniel's Mill, we swam there. Had a lot of fun there. And Hoffman's Pond, right over yonder. That's where I learned to do the dog paddling. Several other of my friends and neighbors. Schools in our area. There was 2 down in Dale. They moved together and came to recovery. And there was one in Bettstown, and that came to Faceville. And in the mid-30s, there was a Munderland school over in the International independent paper company. Bowers Quarters. I don't know, anybody remember that besides me? You remember that, okay. Bowers Quarters, Mr. Bower moved here at the same time J.L. Hand went to Pelham. And Mr. Bower came to Faceville. Both of them made immense fortunes on the land and farming. Mr. Bower built a house where Gerald Woodward's house was at, where you built a nice home up there. That was his home, and you could walk into Florida on his land. I did it one time on a survey team. You could walk from Faceville over into Florida on Bower land, and lots of other land around here. But Mr. Bower had right where Ethel and Jim, where y'all live, there was a slew of houses down that side of that road. When it got so big, you had to have another slew of houses on. That was called Bower's Extension on the other side. Am I right, Miss Davis?
That's right.
All right. Old-timers' names. These are black people that had a lot of influence on a lot of us' life around downtown Faceville. Tookaloo. I remember Tookaloo because he's the only fellow I ever seen could get in a tire and roll it down the road by itself. I mean, he'd hit that ground just right and he'd stay in that tire. Hambone Cunningham. He worked for Mr. J.W. Sellers. Anybody remember him?
Yeah, I talked to us there.
Yeah. Everybody knew Spot and Sally Motley. Spot and Sally Motley. John Brown and Emily Brown. Emily said, "Oh, Lord, look at yonder, where did turkeys come from? Where did fish come from?" Peter Ford, only man I could ever seen in my life to go barefooted right on out in hot ashes and come out on, I don't know how he did it. Toted slabs from Mr. Garrett at the sawmill. President Harding, he was a white man. He had a lot of influence on my life. I'm telling you, he hit me every time I went by. I mean, he didn't play with it neither. He raised me up off the ground. I wasn't no bigger than that. And Mr. Boss Phillips called me Jackarise every time he seen me. Mr. Moan Duke, now that was another one. Mr. Jim Porter and Mr. Bob Wells. Now they had a lot of influence on my life growing up, because every one of them got after me with something or other, at one time or another. If my mama wasn't on my rear end, they was on it. And I may have told y'all before, but I got the worst beating of my life I ever had jumping out that window right there in this old church. But everybody else was outside, and I was going outside too, but I wasn't just about that high. And I crawled out that window, and my mother seen me, and Lord have mercy. School teachers, long ago, professors. McGuffey, y'all remember them? Anybody remember them? Smalley, I know some of you remember Smalley.
Yeah.
Glasscock, Mr. Haynes, and a lot of folks' favorite W.L. Lamb. He was a man that influenced my life a whole lot by a simple phrase that he gave me, and everybody else that would listen to it. You learn to do by doing. Learn to do by doing. You don't do it right the first time, you can do it better the next time. Baseball fields in Faceville. Harm, you got a lot. You played on every team I ever seen play. And he was good at it. We had a field right across from Ethel's house right here at one time. We had a field at the across from R.E. Wells' house in the old pear orchard. And it had bleachers there. Everybody could watch the game sitting on bleachers. And Miss Hattie Bowie had a little soda water joint right across the road on the railroad property. You could get a cold soda water out of a wash tub on Sunday afternoon. Everything else in downtown Faceville was closed at that time. And a nickel, one nickel you got. Everything was a dope then, a dope. And of course we had the school diamond at the schoolhouse. And how many remembers that old clay tennis court we used to have up there? Well, I ain't no telling how many tennis stars we had. in that school, playing tennis on that clay court. Anybody here, brother, I know Gerald did, rode buses to Faceville and O'Clockney and played ball. Do y'all remember doing something like that? Now, wasn't that something? Well, here, take half a day to get there. Play the game, another half a day to get back. One little bit of history.